Story 1. Michael Jeffrey Land was born on May 23, 1969. He was a white male. His mother was Gail Gossett. His biological father was not present in his life for very long. Michael's parents separated when he was still very young. After the separation, his father left the family completely. Michael did not have any contact with his natural father after that point. This meant that Michael grew up without a father figure in his home. Because his biological father was gone, Michael's home life changed. His mother eventually remarried. She married a new husband who became Michael's stepfather. This stepfather did not treat Michael well. He was unkind to him in many ways. For example, the stepfather would take photographs of Michael while he was crying. After taking the pictures, he would show them to Michael and say things like, "This is what you look like, a cry baby." This was meant to embarrass Michael and make him feel bad about himself. When Michael's grandmother passed away, the stepfather showed no sympathy. Instead, he told Michael that he was only allowed to cry for 15 minutes in his room. After those 15 minutes were over, he had to stop crying and act like everything was normal. This treatment made Michael feel unsupported and unloved at home. Michael's early childhood was also affected by his biological father's behavior. Before his parents separated, his father had been abusive toward his mother. This abuse sometimes happened when Michael was in the same room and could see it. Even though Michael was very young when his parents separated, he grew up in what doctors would later call a climate of fear. This meant that he felt afraid and unsafe during his early years because of the tension and violence he witnessed. This unstable environment had a lasting effect on his emotional development. Michael also had some physical conditions that made his childhood more difficult. He was born with a club foot. This condition made it harder for him to walk in a normal way. He also had eyes that were set further apart than most people's eyes. These physical differences made him stand out from other children. Because of his appearance, and because he was shorter than most children his age, Michael was bullied a lot during his school years. Other children made fun of him and picked on him. He was often the target of mean comments and teasing. As he got older, his height did not increase much. When he became an adult, Michael was only 5 feet and 2 inches tall. This small size continued to make him different from other people throughout his life. Because of all these problems at home and at school, Michael had emotional and behavioral difficulties. He struggled to control his impulses. He had trouble following rules and behaving in acceptable ways. When he was 17 years old, in June of 1986, he was treated at a mental health facility called Hillcrest. Doctors who examined him there made notes about his condition. They wrote that he suffered from a conduct disorder. This means he had a pattern of behavior that went against social norms and the rights of others. They also noted that he had significant impulse control problems, which meant he often acted without thinking about the consequences. The doctors recorded that Michael had an unstable home environment. They also noted that he did not have a father figure in his life. All of these factors contributed to his emotional struggles during his teenage years. Despite these challenges, Michael had some family members who stayed connected to him. His mother, Gail Gossett, was present in his life. She later became a police officer in Birmingham. Michael also had a brother named Jason Land. He had a grandfather named Glenn Morrison, who seemed to be an important person in his life. At some point, Michael lived with his grandfather. These family connections provided some stability, but they could not erase the problems from his earlier childhood. The combination of an absent father, an unkind stepfather, a difficult home environment, bullying at school, and his own emotional struggles shaped Michael's personality and behavior as he grew into adulthood. He became a person who had trouble forming normal relationships, and who sometimes made poor decisions without thinking about the results. Candace Brown was the victim in this case. She was a 30-year-old white female. She worked at a financial institution, and she was also taking college courses at a local university. She had a 2-year-old son named Michael. Her life revolved around her child and helping other people. She was a faithful Christian, and she took part in a prison ministry. This meant she visited prisons to talk with inmates and try to help them change their lives. Through this prison ministry, Candace briefly met Michael Land. She was visiting a friend of Land's who was in prison. This was how they came to know each other. It was not a close friendship. They were only casual acquaintances. About a week before the main crime happened, Candace's home was burglarized. During that burglary, her purse was stolen. The telephone wires leading into her house were also cut. Candace told the police that she suspected Michael Land was the person who committed that burglary. She gave his name to the police as a suspect. This was important because it showed that Land already knew Candace's home and how to get into it. On the evening of May 18, 1992, Candace drove to her mother's house to pick up her young son. Because her home had been burglarized just 5 days earlier, her mother and her brother were worried about her safety. They decided to follow Candace back to her house to make sure everything was okay. They checked the house and made sure it was safe. Then they left Candace's home at approximately 9 o'clock that night. Candace and her 2-year-old son were alone in the house after that. Later that night, Michael Land took action. He went to Candace's house. He had a plan to commit a burglary. He knew the house because he had been there before. He also had tools with him. He carried wire cutters and a pair of gloves. He also had a .45 caliber automatic handgun. The first thing Land did was cut the telephone wires leading into the house. He used the wire cutters for this task. By cutting the wires, he made sure that Candace could not call for help if she woke up. This was an important step in his plan because it prevented her from contacting the police or anyone else. Next, Land approached a window near the back entry of the house. There was a storm window on the outside. He removed that storm window first. Behind it was an interior window made of glass panes. Land used a tool to cut and remove several panes of that interior window glass. He removed enough glass to create an opening big enough for him to climb through. He was wearing gloves while he did this, which protected his hands from being cut by the sharp glass. As Land was cutting the glass, he left behind evidence. One of the panes that he removed fell to the ground outside. On that pane of glass, his shoe left a clear imprint. The bottom of his shoe had a distinctive tread design. This design spelled out the letters USA. This shoe print would later be an important clue. After he removed the glass, Land climbed through the window and entered the kitchen of Candace's home. He was inside the house now. Candace and her 2-year-old son were asleep somewhere in the house. Land was there to commit a burglary, which means he planned to steal things from the house. However, something unexpected happened. The noise from the breaking glass and the entry woke Candace up. She got out of bed and walked into the kitchen. When she saw Land and possibly other men in her kitchen, she realized there was an intruder. There was a confrontation. At some point during this encounter, Candace was knocked to the floor. She suffered injuries to her nose and mouth, and she bled. At this point, Land did not leave. Instead of running away, he abducted Candace from her own home. He forced her to leave with him. She was taken away from her house against her will. Her 2-year-old son was left behind in the house all alone. The little boy was unharmed, but he was left without his mother. A puppy was also in the house with the child. Land took Candace to a different location. He drove her to a limestone quarry on Ruffner Mountain. This was an area near her home. The quarry was a rocky, isolated place where people did not usually go. This location was chosen because it was hidden and far from any help. At the quarry, Land forced Candace to lie down on the ground. Then he shot her one time in the back of her head. He used his .45 caliber automatic handgun to fire the bullet. The shot was fatal. Candace died immediately from the gunshot wound. Her body was left at the quarry. After committing the murder, Land left the quarry. He drove away and went back to his normal activities. He did not change his clothes or wash off any evidence. He was still wearing the same clothes, gloves, and shoes that he had worn during the break-in and the shooting. He also kept the .45 caliber handgun with him. The next day, on May 19, 1992, Candace's landlord came to her house. He was there to supervise the installation of a fence. When he arrived, he immediately saw that something was wrong. He noticed that a window near the back entry had been broken. He also saw that the telephone wires to the house had been cut again. He looked at Candace's car and saw that the window on the driver's side was shattered. The landlord knocked on the front door, but nobody answered. He became very worried. He asked a neighbor to call the police. Then he went to his own home to get a spare set of keys so he could open the front door. When the police arrived, they found that all the doors to the house were locked. They saw the broken window and the removed glass panes. They found the storm window lying nearby. They also saw the shoe print on the pane of glass that was lying on the ground. The shoe print had the letters USA in the tread pattern. The landlord opened the front door with his spare keys, and the police entered the house. Inside, they found Candace's 2-year-old son. The child was completely unharmed. He was alone in the house with a puppy. There was no sign of Candace anywhere in the house. The police understood that she had been taken from her home against her will. While searching the house, the police also found a note on a bulletin board. The note had Michael Land's name written on it. It also had his phone number and his mother's phone number. This was a direct link between Land and Candace. It showed that she knew him and had his contact information in her home. The police noticed many pieces of evidence. They saw the broken window and the cut telephone wires. They saw the shoe print. They saw the note with Land's name. They knew that Land had been named as a suspect in the earlier burglary. They also knew that Land had briefly met Candace through the prison ministry. All of these facts pointed in one direction. The police began to focus their attention on Michael Land as the person who had done this. After the police found the evidence at Candace Brown's house, they needed to find Michael Land. They called Land's mother, who was a Birmingham police officer. She told them that her son was working at a shopping mall called Riverchase Galleria. He was repairing the roof of the mall that day. The police officers went to the mall and found Land at his work. They told him they were investigating Candace Brown's disappearance. Land agreed to go with them to the police station to answer some questions. At the police station, Land was taken to an interrogation room. The officers read him his Miranda rights. This meant they told him he had the right to remain silent and the right to have a lawyer present. Land signed a form that said he understood his rights and agreed to speak with them. He also agreed to have his statement recorded on tape. In this first recorded statement, Land said he knew Candace Brown, but had not seen her for about a week. He said he had no idea where she was and no knowledge about the break-in at her house. He also provided an alibi. He said he had been visiting his girlfriend at her parents' apartment until about 11:30 on the night of May 18th. He claimed he fell asleep in his car in the parking lot and then drove to his grandfather's house. He said he reported to work early the next morning and had lunch with a different girlfriend that day. He also said his car was parked at that second girlfriend's house. During the interview, one of the detectives looked at Land's shoes. He noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on them. He also saw that the tread pattern on the bottom of Land's shoes looked very similar to the USA print that was found on the glass pane at Candace's house. The police asked Land to remove his shoes and clothes. They gave him a jail uniform to wear instead. At this point, Land was under arrest. While Land was at the station, the police contacted his alibi witness. This was the girlfriend he said he had lunch with. She told the police that she had not eaten lunch with Land that day. She also said his car was not parked at her house. This meant Land's alibi was false. He had lied about his whereabouts. The police went back to Land and told him that his alibi witness had not confirmed his story. They told him he needed to tell the truth. Land agreed to give a second statement, but he refused to have it recorded on tape. The police again read him his Miranda rights, and he waived them once more. In this second statement, Land changed his story. He said he had met two men at a gas station late on the night of May 18th. He named them Tony and Edward. He said these men asked him if he knew an easy mark for a burglary. That meant they wanted to know about a house that would be easy to break into and steal from. Land said he suggested Candace Brown's house. He said the men paid him $20 to cut the window glass and remove it. Then the three of them entered the kitchen through that window. Land said that while they were inside, Candace woke up and came into the kitchen. He said one of the two men slapped her and knocked her to the floor. He said her nose and mouth started to bleed. Land said he got scared and left the house at that point. He said he did not know what happened to her after he left. He also admitted that he had lied about his car's location. He told the police that his car was actually parked at the mall where he worked, not at his girlfriend's house. After giving this second statement, Land was formally arrested. He was charged with crimes related to Candace's disappearance. The police then searched Land's car. They found a .45 caliber automatic handgun in the trunk. They also found the wire cutters he had used to cut the telephone wires. They found a pair of gloves that had glass fragments embedded in them. On May 20th, 1992, a group of high school students was hiking on Ruffner Mountain. They discovered Candace Brown's body in the limestone quarry. The police were notified. An autopsy was performed. The medical examiner determined that Candace had been shot once in the back of the head. The bullet was recovered from her body. The police took the bullet from Candace's head and test-fired the .45 caliber handgun found in Land's car. The forensic experts compared the two bullets. They determined that the bullet from Candace's head had been fired from that exact handgun. This was a direct connection between Land and the murder. The forensic scientists also examined the gloves found in Land's car. They found two types of glass fragments on the gloves. One type of glass matched the glass from the broken window in Candace's house. The other type matched the glass from the shattered window of Candace's car. This showed that Land had been near both broken windows. The scientists also examined Land's shoes. They confirmed that the tread pattern on the bottom matched the USA shoe print found on the glass pane outside Candace's window. This placed Land at the scene of the break-in. Most importantly, the scientists found a semen stain on Candace Brown's blouse. They took a sample of Land's blood and created a DNA profile. They compared the DNA from the semen stain to Land's DNA profile. The test showed that the semen matched Land's blood. The probability that the semen came from someone other than Land was roughly 1 in 20 million. This was extremely strong evidence that Land had been in close contact with Candace. Land was brought to trial in an Alabama state court. He was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. The first count was murder during a burglary. The second count was murder during a kidnapping. The jury heard all of the evidence. They heard about the shoe print, the handgun, the bullet match, the glass fragments, the DNA evidence, and Land's changing statements to the police. The jury found Land guilty on both counts of capital murder. After the conviction, a separate sentencing hearing was held. The same jury had to decide whether to recommend a death sentence or life in prison without parole. The jury voted 11-1 in favor of the death penalty. The trial judge followed the jury's recommendation. He sentenced Michael Jeffrey Land to death. Land then began a long series of appeals. He appealed his conviction and sentence to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals. That court affirmed his conviction and death sentence. He then appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court. That court also affirmed the conviction and sentence. He then asked the United States Supreme Court to review his case, but they refused to hear it. Land also filed a post-conviction petition in state court under Alabama Rule of Criminal Procedure 32. This was a way to raise new issues that were not raised at trial. He argued that his lawyers had been ineffective. He said they failed to present enough evidence about his difficult childhood and his mental problems during the sentencing phase. The state court held a hearing on this petition. Land's mother testified about his childhood. A psychologist named Dr. Catherine Boyer testified about Land's mental health. She said he had an antisocial personality disorder. However, the state court denied the petition. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed that denial, and the Alabama Supreme Court refused to hear it again. Land then filed a petition for habeas corpus in federal court. This was a request to have a federal judge review his case. He raised similar arguments about his confession, his trial, and his sentencing. The federal district court denied his petition. He appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. That court also denied his petition in 2009. It found that the state courts had not made unreasonable decisions. All of Land's appeals were exhausted. No court found a reason to overturn his conviction or death sentence. On August 12, 2010, Land was scheduled to be executed at Holman Prison in Atmore, Alabama. His execution was set for 6 o'clock in the evening. He would die by lethal injection. This means he would be given drugs that would stop his heart and breathing. Before the execution, Land requested clemency from the governor of Alabama, Bob Riley. Clemency means the governor could choose to reduce his sentence to life in prison instead of death. Land's lawyers argued that he had changed while in prison. They said he had earned his GED diploma. They said he had created a laundry system and worked as a runner delivering mail and meals. They argued that he had turned his life around. However, Governor Riley turned down the request for clemency. He said he would not change the decisions of the jury and the courts. Land's lawyers also filed last-minute appeals to stop the execution. They asked the Alabama Supreme Court to halt it, but that court refused. They then asked the United States Supreme Court to stop it. That court also refused less than an hour before the scheduled execution. On the day of the execution, Land's family visited him. His mother, Gail Gossett, was there. His stepfather, Ellis Gossett, was there. His brother, Jason Land, was also there. His grandfather, Glenn Morrison, came to say goodbye. Land was given a final meal. Because of prison rules, he got his meal from vending machines in the visitation yard. He ate a meatball sub sandwich, a double pork chop sandwich, and a Philly cheesesteak sandwich. He drank an orange soda and some orange juice. The execution took place in the death chamber at Holman Prison. Land was placed on a hospital-style gurney. His arms were stretched out. The warden, Tony Patterson, asked Land if he had any final words. Land replied, "No. Thank you, though." Those were his last spoken words. A chaplain named Chris Summers knelt beside Land. He held Land's left hand and prayed with him. Land lay quietly. At some point, he closed his eyes and became unconscious. The drugs took effect. A guard came over and rubbed Land's forehead, but there was no response. At exactly 6:23 p.m., Michael Jeffrey Land was pronounced dead. Candace Brown's family attended the execution. Her parents, John and Brenda Brown, were there. Her 3 brothers were present. Her son, Michael, who was now 19 years old, also witnessed the execution. The family had waited 18 years for this moment. They had raised Candace's son after her death. They had lived with the loss of their daughter and sister for nearly 2 decades. After the execution, the family did not speak to reporters. They had come to see justice carried out. They had represented their daughter in her final moments. Michael Jeffrey Land spent 17 years on Alabama's death row. He was executed for the murder of Candace Brown, a 30-year-old mother who was taken from her home, shot in the head, and left in a quarry. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His conviction and death sentence were upheld by every court that reviewed his case. On August 12, 2010, the sentence was finally carried out. The case of Michael Jeffrey Land and Candace Brown came to a complete end on that day in the death chamber at Holman Prison. Story 2. Peter Anthony Cantu was born on May 27, 1975, in Houston, Texas. Houston is a large city in the southern part of the United States. Peter grew up in this city with his family. He had at least one older brother, whose name was Joe Cantu. The family lived together in a home in Houston. Peter's family was not wealthy, and they lived a simple life. Peter went to school in Houston like other children his age, but from a very young age he had problems in school. He did not follow the rules that teachers and principals set. He often got into fights with other students. He would shout and use bad language at his teachers. His behavior was aggressive, and he did not seem to care about the consequences. Because of these ongoing problems, Peter was moved to an alternative school when he was in the 6th grade. An alternative school is a special school for students who cannot behave well in regular schools. Even in that alternative school, Peter continued to cause trouble. He threatened security personnel at the school. Peter's bad behavior was not limited to school. He also had problems with the law and with other people outside of school. When Peter was only 11 years old, he stole a bicycle from an 8-year-old child. After stealing the bicycle, he did something strange. He turned the bicycle in to the authorities and claimed a reward for finding it. This showed that he was willing to lie and cheat to get what he wanted. As Peter got older, his behavior became more serious. He threatened a woman and broke a window at her home. He threatened another student's father and told him that he wanted to kill the man. He also threatened to kill a police officer. He made threats at a hospital and later made threats while he was in jail. These threats showed that Peter had no respect for authority and was not afraid of violence. Peter also had problems with physical violence. He attacked a 6th grade teacher at his school. He fought with other students and created a hostile environment wherever he went. By the time he was a teenager, he had developed a pattern of aggressive and threatening behavior. He did not seem to care about the harm he caused to others. In January 1993, Peter got into a serious incident at the Astrodome parking lot. The Astrodome is a large sports stadium in Houston. Peter threatened another young person with a knife during an argument. Because of this incident, Peter was put on probation for assault. Probation meant that he was allowed to stay out of prison, but he had to follow strict rules and report to an officer. This did not stop his bad behavior. Peter also had a group of friends that he spent time with. They called themselves a gang. Peter saw himself as the leader of this group. The group had a name, and they followed certain rules. Peter's role as the leader meant that other members listened to what he said. He liked being in charge and having control over others. He had a short temper and was quick to use threats or violence when he did not get his way. Peter did not finish regular high school. Instead, he earned a GED, which is a certificate that shows he had the same knowledge as a high school graduate. After that, he worked as a laborer. This meant he did physical work for money. His work history was not notable, and he did not seem to have a clear plan for his future. By the time Peter Cantu was 18 years old, he had already built a long history of violent acts, threats, and criminal behavior. He had stolen from a child, threatened many people, attacked teachers, broken windows, used a knife, and been put on probation. He was the leader of a group of young men who followed him. He had no respect for the law or for other people. His past showed a pattern of aggression that was getting worse over time. The people around him, including his brother Joe and his sister-in-law Christina, knew about his temper and his violent tendencies. Peter seemed to be heading toward even more serious trouble, but at this point in his life, he had not yet committed the crime that would define his future. The events that led to the crime began on the evening of June 24, 1993. On that night, Peter Cantu and a group of other young men gathered at T.C. Jester Park in Houston. The group included Derek Sean O'Brien, Jose Medellin, Efren Perez, and Roman Sandoval. Also present were Roman's brother Frank Sandoval and Jose's 14-year-old brother Venancio Medellin. The purpose of the gathering was to initiate a new member into their gang. The new member was Raul Villarreal, who was 17 years old. The initiation ritual was simple and violent. Raul had to fight each member of the gang for 5 to 10 minutes. He fought against 3 members and then briefly lost consciousness. After that, the gang considered him accepted as a new member. Once the initiation was over, the group drank beer and engaged in horseplay, which means they were playfully wrestling and messing around. Peter Cantu was frustrated because he had not gotten a chance to fight Raul during the initiation. He was the self-appointed leader of the group, and he wanted to prove his dominance. After some time, the group left the park and headed toward some nearby railroad tracks. At the same time, 2 teenage girls were also heading toward those same railroad tracks. The girls were Jennifer Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Pena, who was 16 years old. They had been visiting a friend's house that evening. They left the friend's house at about 11:15 at night and needed to get home by their midnight curfew. They knew they would be late if they took the normal streets, so they decided to take a shortcut across the railroad tracks. They did not know that the group of young men was also in that area. As the girls walked along the tracks, they first encountered Roman and Frank Sandoval. They passed them without any trouble, but then they came near Jose Medellin. Jose grabbed Elizabeth and dragged her down a hill. Elizabeth screamed for help. Jennifer heard her friend screaming and ran back to try to help. As Jennifer ran back, Peter Cantu grabbed her and dragged her down the hill as well. At this point, Roman and Frank Sandoval decided to leave. Peter asked them if they wanted to get some, which meant he was asking if they wanted to rape the girls. Roman told Peter that he did not rape or kill girls, and the 2 brothers walked away. The remaining gang members then began to assault the 2 girls. Peter Cantu, Derek O'Brien, Jose Medellin, Efren Perez, and Raul Villarreal all took part in the attack. Venancio Medellin, who was only 14, watched as the others raped both girls. The rapes were vaginal, oral, and anal. The assault lasted for more than 1 hour. The girls were forced to perform sexual acts on the attackers. At one point, Peter told Venancio that he should get some as well, so Venancio joined in and raped Jennifer Ertman. While the rapes were still happening, Peter whispered to Venancio. He said, "We're going to have to kill them." This meant that Peter had already decided that the girls could not be allowed to live because they could identify the attackers. The rapes continued for the full hour before the attackers finally stopped. When everyone was finished, Peter told the group to take the girls into the woods. He told Venancio to stay behind because he said Venancio was too little to watch. The other 5 attackers then dragged the girls deeper into the wooded area. They began to strangle them. Derek O'Brien took off his red nylon belt. Jose Medellin and Derek O'Brien wrapped the belt around Jennifer Ertman's neck. One man pulled on each end of the belt. They pulled so hard that the belt snapped in 2. After the belt broke, they used Jennifer's own shoelaces to finish strangling her. At the same time, Peter used Elizabeth Pena's shoelaces to strangle her. Elizabeth cried and begged the attackers not to kill her. She offered to give them her phone number so they could meet again, but they did not stop. The attackers did not stop even after the strangulation. Peter kicked Elizabeth in the face with his steel-toed boots. The kicking was so hard that several of her teeth were knocked out. The attackers also kicked Jennifer Ertman so hard that several of her ribs were broken. After the kicking, all of the attackers took turns stomping on both girls' necks to make absolutely sure they were dead. They left the bodies in the woods. Before leaving, Peter took jewelry and money from Jennifer Ertman. He took her rings, necklaces, and cash. Then the attackers left the bodies where they lay and walked away. Later that night, several of the attackers went to Peter Cantu's house. His older brother Joe Cantu and his sister-in-law Christina Cantu were at the home. The attackers began to brag about what they had done. They talked about the rapes and the killings in graphic detail. They laughed about it. Jose Medellin said they had fun, and that their activities would be seen on the TV news. Peter walked into the house while the others were talking. He did not look upset or ashamed. Instead, he appeared happy and amused by the conversation. He agreed with everything they said. He said things like, "Yeah, I did that," when they talked about raping the girls. He also parceled out the jewelry and money he had taken from the victims. He gave some of the stolen items to the other attackers. Joe Cantu and Christina Cantu noticed that some of the attackers had blood on their clothes. Christina later said she felt sick when she heard them talking. She knew that something terrible had happened, but at that moment, no one called the police. The two families of the girls realized their daughters had not come home. They began searching for them the next morning. They called the police and filed missing persons reports. They also printed flyers with pictures of the girls and handed them out all over Houston. For days passed. The girls' bodies were still lying in the woods, hidden by the trees. The summer heat in Houston was extreme, and the bodies were decomposing quickly. The attackers had not confessed. They had not told anyone where the bodies were. The families did not know what had happened to their daughters. But inside the Cantu home, Christina was struggling with what she had heard. She felt sorry for the families of the missing girls. She wanted them to be able to bury their daughters properly. She convinced her husband Joe to call the police. He agreed. He was about to make a call that would change everything. But the investigation itself had not yet begun, and the arrests had not yet happened. Joe Cantu, Peter's older brother, placed an anonymous call to the Houston Police Department's Crime Stoppers tip line. He identified himself as Gonzalez and told the operator that the missing girls' bodies could be found near T.C. Jester Park at White Oak Bayou. The police were sent to the park and searched the area, but they did not find anything at first. While a police helicopter was flying over the park, Joe Cantu made a second call. This time he called 911 and directed the police to look on the other side of the bayou. The police followed his direction and found the bodies. The girls' remains were badly decomposed because they had been lying in the summer heat for 4 days. The medical examiner had to use dental records to identify them. However, enough tissue remained for the medical examiner to determine that the girls had died from strangulation. The police traced the 911 call back to the Cantu home. They went to the house and questioned Joe Cantu. Joe admitted that he was both the Crime Stoppers tipster and the 911 caller. He gave the police the names of everyone involved in the crime, except for Raul Villarreal, because he did not know Raul's name. The police then began arresting the suspects. When they arrested Peter Cantu, he tried to kick a television cameraman who was filming the arrest. This showed that Peter was still aggressive and uncooperative even when faced with the police. Once Peter was in custody, he gave 2 written confessions. In the first confession, he admitted that he had raped the girls and stolen from them, but he did not admit to killing them. The police told Peter that one of the other attackers had already confessed to everything. After hearing that, Peter gave a second confession. In this second statement, he fully admitted his role in the murders. He described how the girls were strangled and how he kicked one of the girls in the face with his steel-toed boots. He also admitted to stomping on their necks to make sure they were dead. His confession matched the physical evidence found at the crime scene. The police also recovered some of the stolen jewelry from Peter's bedroom. This was important physical evidence that connected him to the robbery. Other attackers also confessed, including Derek O'Brien, Jose Medellin, and Venancio Medellin. The arrests were complete, and all of the participants were in custody. After the arrests, a grand jury indicted Peter Cantu for capital murder on September 23, 1993. The trial began in early 1994. The prosecution presented a strong case against Peter. They used his 2 confessions, the testimony of his brother Joe and sister-in-law Christina, the physical evidence like the jewelry found in his room, and the statements from other gang members. The defense tried to argue that Peter was young and had problems, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The jury found Peter Kanta guilty of capital murder on February 3, 1994. The punishment phase of the trial came next. The jury had to decide whether Peter should receive the death penalty or life in prison. The prosecution presented evidence of Peter's long history of violent behavior, including the theft of the bicycle, the threats he made, the assault on his teacher, and the knife incident at the Astrodome. They also argued that Peter would continue to be a danger to society if he were allowed to live. The jury considered all of the evidence. On February 9, 1994, they answered the special issues in a way that required the judge to sentence Peter to death. The judge, William Harmon, imposed the death penalty. Immediately after the sentence was pronounced, the judge allowed Jennifer Ertman's father, Randy Ertman, to speak directly to Peter. Randy yelled at Peter to look at him. This was one of the first times a victim's family member was allowed to speak directly to a convicted killer in Texas, and it helped change the law to allow victim impact statements in all cases. Peter began his time on death row. He filed appeals to try to overturn his conviction and sentence. In January 1997, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed his conviction and death sentence. In December 1997, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his case. Peter then filed a state habeas corpus petition in February 1998, but it was denied in December 2006. He filed a federal habeas petition in September 2007, but the federal district court denied relief in February 2009. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit affirmed that denial in August 2009. In April 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court again refused to hear his case. All of his legal options were exhausted. While Peter was on death row, the other attackers also went through the legal system. Derek Sean O'Brien, Jose Medellin, Raul Villarreal, and Efren Perez were all convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Venancio Medellin, who was only 14 at the time of the crimes, was not eligible for the death penalty. He was convicted of aggravated sexual assault and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Later, the U.S. Supreme Court made a ruling in 2005 that said executing people who were under 18 at the time of their crimes was unconstitutional. Because of this ruling, Raul Villarreal and Efren Perez, who had been 17 at the time of the murders, had their death sentences commuted to life in prison. This meant they would never be executed, but would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Derek Sean O'Brien was executed in July 2006. Before he died, he apologized for his role in the murders. Jose Medellin was executed in August 2008. He also apologized for what he had done. Peter Kanta was the last of the three who were sentenced to death to be executed. His execution date was set for August 17, 2010. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles refused his clemency petition on August 13, 2010, which meant the governor could not stop the execution. On the day of the execution, Peter Kanta was taken to the Huntsville Unit Prison. He was given a final meal of enchiladas, fajitas, and a cinnamon bun. He did not request any interviews with reporters before his death. He did not invite any family members to witness the execution. His family did not attend. At 6:09 p.m. on August 17, 2010, the lethal injection drugs were administered into Peter Kanta's body. The parents of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena watched through the window. Peter Kanta did not look toward the witnesses. He did not make a last statement. He stared straight up at the ceiling, took one deep breath, and closed his eyes. At 6:17 p.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 35 years old. After the execution, the families of the two girls spoke to the media. Adolfo Pena, Elizabeth's father, said that the execution did not give them closure, but it gave them some satisfaction. He said that 3 of the animals who did this were now gone. Randy and Sandra Ertman did not speak to the press. A family friend said they were ready to put the crime and its aftermath as far behind them as possible. The families turned their attention to the remaining attackers, Raul Villarreal and Efren Perez, who are serving life sentences, and Venancio Medellin, who is serving 40 years and may be eligible for parole in the future. The murders of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena had a lasting impact on the city of Houston. Memorial benches were placed at T.C. Jester Park and at Waltrip High School, where both girls had been students. The case forced city officials to recognize that gangs were a serious problem in Houston. The victims' families, with the help of a crime victims advocate named Andy Cahan, worked to change Texas law so that victims' families could witness executions. They also helped change the law to allow victim impact statements. The names of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena have not been forgotten by the people of Houston, and the story of what happened to them continues to be remembered as one of the most notorious crimes in the city's history. Peter Anthony Cantu was executed for the capital murder of Jennifer Ertman, and his death marked the final execution connected to the brutal murders of two innocent teenage girls who were simply trying to get home before their curfew. Story 3. Hollywood was born on July 4th, 1960. He grew up in a small town in Alabama. His family did not have much money. His mother died when he was only 10 years old. This was a very hard time for him and his siblings. After his mother passed away, Holly and his brothers and sisters went to live with a cousin. They stayed in a house with many other people. There were about 16 people living in that house. Space was very limited and life was difficult. Holly went to school in Luverne, Alabama. He attended Luverne High School. But school was not easy for him. He had trouble learning. He was placed in special education classes. These classes were for students who had lower IQ scores and needed extra help with their schoolwork. The special education classroom was in the basement of the school. Other students made fun of the special education students. They called them names like moles because they had classes in the basement. The basement room was not nice. Sometimes it flooded when it rained. The lighting was poor. Holly's teachers noticed certain things about him. One of his teachers said he was a quiet student. He did not always try his hardest in class, but he also did not fail his classes. He got C-range grades. Another teacher said Holly was always neat and clean. He took care of how he looked. But other students and teachers noticed that Holly sometimes had a bad smell about him. His appearance was not always consistent. Holly did not finish high school. When he turned 15 years old, he quit school. He left school to get a job. He wanted to help provide for his family. His sister Johnny said Holly was the only son left in the household, so he felt it was his duty to help support his sisters. He got a job at the Pepsi-Cola plant. He gave money from his job to his sister, so she could buy groceries and cleaning supplies for the family. He also bought a car for the family. He paid about $200 for the car. He made a down payment and then paid money on the car every 2 weeks. Holly had several jobs over the years. He worked at a company called Sanders Lead. His boss there said Holly was an average person. He did not seem unusual or different from other employees. He followed instructions well. He got along with other workers. He did not cause problems at work. He was on time and worked hard. He was dependable. His boss noted that the work environment was dangerous. If Holly was not paying attention, he could have been seriously hurt. But he managed to do his work safely. Holly was able to function on his own in many ways. He could manage his own money. He always seemed to have cash. He bought several cars over the years and paid for most of them in cash. He liked cars and subscribed to a magazine called Hot Rod. He was interested in cars and kept his vehicles clean and detailed. He could plan and cook meals for himself and others. He could solve everyday problems. For example, if the lights went out in his house, he knew to check the fuse box. He was neat in how he dressed and how he kept himself. He cared about his clothes and his hair. Holly had a girlfriend named Barbara Seiler. They dated for about 3 years, from 1981 to 1984. During their relationship, Barbara noticed that Holly seemed like an average man. Nothing struck her as slow or unusual about him. She thought he was pretty capable. They even talked about possibly getting married. He drove to see her often, even when they lived in different towns. When they went to motels, Holly would go inside and get the room himself. He seemed to handle things normally. But the relationship with Barbara did not go well. Holly became abusive toward Barbara. There was an argument between them. The sheriff had to come to Barbara's mother's house because of the disturbance. This upset Barbara's mother very much. Because of this, Barbara ended the relationship. She did not want to see Holly anymore. Holly did not accept the breakup well. He wanted to talk to Barbara, but she refused to see him. He tried to get her to come outside to speak with him. When she would not come out, he became angry. He shot Barbara through the window of her home. He was arrested and convicted of this crime. He received a 15-year prison sentence for shooting Barbara Seiler. Holly was released on parole before his full sentence was completed. He was released from prison in June 1993. After getting out of prison, he tried to move on with his life. He met another woman named Ruby Gosha. Ruby became his girlfriend. She also became the mother of his child. But his pattern of difficult relationships continued. Ruby lived with her mother, Annie Gosha, in Troy, Alabama. She lived there with her children. Around 2 weeks before the events that would later happen, Ruby had an encounter with Holly. He approached her while she was sitting in her car. He cut her on her arm or wrist. This injury caused Ruby to lose the use of 2 of her fingers. Ruby told her mother about this incident. She told her mother that Holly had come up behind her and cut her. Holly had a history of getting into trouble with the law. Over the years, he had been arrested many times. He had about 19 arrests on his record. Many of these were for traffic violations, but some were for more serious offenses, including theft and harassment. He had also been in prison before. He was on parole at the time of his relationship with Ruby. This meant he was supposed to follow certain rules. But he continued to have problems with anger and impulse control. He had difficulty controlling his temper. He had a pattern of reacting violently when he felt rejected by women. By the summer of 1993, Holly was living in Luverne, Alabama, with his father. He was trying to get his life back together after being released from prison. But his troubles were not over. He was still thinking about Ruby. Ruby did not want to be with him anymore. But Holly could not accept this. He went to Ruby's mother's house on September 1st, 1993. He brought cigarettes and diapers for his child. But Ruby told him to leave her alone. She said their relationship was over. Annie Gosha also told Holly to leave her property. She told him never to come back. Holly left the house. But before he left, he told Ruby that he would get her someday. On the evening of September 1st, 1993, Hollywood did not stay away from Ruby Gosha's home. He had been told to leave and never come back, but he ignored that command. He decided to return that same night. Earlier that day, Holly had been drinking alcohol. He spent the afternoon thinking about Ruby. He was upset that she did not want to be with him anymore. He was also upset that he might not see his child. As the evening went on, his anger and frustration grew stronger. At some point between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m., Holly went to his mother's house in Luverne. He picked up his cousin, Calvin Salter. Holly was driving his father's pickup truck. He told Salter to drive the truck. They drove from Luverne to Troy, Alabama. That was where Ruby lived with her mother. When they arrived in Troy, they drove past Annie Gosha's house. Holly did not stop there at first. Instead, he had Salter drive to a nearby street. Holly got out of the truck. He told Salter to circle the block while he was gone. Salter did what Holly asked. He drove around the block and then parked the truck. While Salter was driving, a car driven by a man named Amp passed by. Holly saw this and told Salter to follow that car. Holly said that if he caught Ruby and Amp together, he would kill Ruby. They followed Amp's car until it passed the Gosha residence. Then Holly directed Salter to drive slowly toward the house. When they were close, Holly told Salter to stop the truck. Holly took a 12-gauge shotgun from the gun rack in the truck. This was a single-shot shotgun, a Harrington and Richardson brand. He put the gun down the leg of his pants and covered it with his shirt. He wanted to hide the weapon, so no one would see it. He then left the truck and walked toward Annie Gosha's house. Salter parked the truck at a nearby apartment complex. He went to a public pay telephone and made a phone call. After he finished the call, he began walking back to the truck. As he walked, Holly called out to him from the street behind the Gosha house. Salter went over to him. Holly told Salter that he had not seen Ruby at the house. He said he was going to go back up to the house anyway. Holly then walked toward the house again. Salter went back to the pay phone to make another call. While Salter was on the phone, he heard a loud sound. It was a gunshot. He hung up the phone and returned to the truck. When he got to the truck, Holly was already sitting inside it. Holly told Salter, "Let's go to Loverne." Salter started driving back to Loverne. As they drove, Holly told Salter what he had done. He said he had shot Ruby while she was lying in bed asleep. Then he made a statement about Ruby. He said, "I shot that bitch in the head and blew her brains out, and all she did was wiggle." He was not sorry for what he had done. He was bragging about it. Holly also told Salter something else. He said that sometime before the shooting, he had tried to stab Ruby in the heart. But Ruby had thrown her arm up to protect herself. The knife went into her arm instead. He had stabbed her in the arm. This was the injury that caused Ruby to lose the use of 2 fingers. During the drive back to Loverne, Holly started throwing shotgun shells out the window. He was trying to get rid of evidence. He told Salter that he knew he had killed Ruby. He also said that the police would be coming after him. When they arrived in Loverne, they went to the house of Holly's father. Holly took the shotgun out of the truck. He and Salter walked to a nearby wooded area. They buried the shotgun under a pile of leaves. They wanted to hide the weapon so the police would not find it. After that, they went to sleep in a shed next to Holly's father's house. At the same time, inside Annie Gosha's house, something terrible had happened. Annie Gosha and Ruby had gone to their separate bedrooms around 9 p.m. Annie was lying in her bed watching television. Then she heard a sound. It was a loud pop, like a firecracker going off. Annie got up to check what had happened. She went through Ruby's bedroom and into the kitchen. She saw that the door to the outside was open. Then she went back into Ruby's bedroom. That is when she found Ruby lying in bed. Ruby had been shot. There was a gunshot wound near her eye and another near her cheek. Ruby was badly hurt. Annie Gosha called the police and an ambulance. Paramedics arrived and took Ruby to the hospital. They transported her to the Edge Regional Medical Center emergency room in Troy. But Ruby was already too badly injured. The shotgun blast had fractured her skull and injured her brain. She died before the ambulance could save her. Ruby Lois Gosha was 34 years old. Later, a doctor performed an autopsy on Ruby's body. The doctor found many injuries. There were shotgun pellets in Ruby's head that had caused the fatal wounds. The doctor also found recent bruises on Ruby's palm and the back of her left hand. There were 2 recent scars on her right forearm. There was a recent scar on her left forearm and another on her left upper arm. These injuries matched the story that Holly had cut Ruby 2 weeks before the murder. The shotgun that Holly used was a 12-gauge single-shot shotgun. When police later examined it, they found residue in the barrel. This showed that the gun had not been cleaned after it was last fired. The wadding and lead shot pellets found inside Ruby's head were consistent with the type of ammunition used in that shotgun. The wadding was a 12-gauge type used in Remington shotgun shells. The pellets were size number 6 shot. All of this evidence connected Holly's shotgun to the murder. At the time Holly killed Ruby, he was already on parole. He had been released from prison for the earlier shooting of Barbara Seiler. He was not supposed to commit any new crimes, but he did. He had also been arrested many times before. He had a long history of violent behavior toward women. Ruby was the mother of Holly's child. She had tried to end the relationship. She had told him to leave her alone. Her mother had told him to stay away from the house. But Holly did not care. He planned his attack carefully. He brought his shotgun. He used his cousin to drive him. He hid the weapon. He entered the house when everyone was asleep. He shot Ruby while she was lying defenseless in her own bed. He then ran away and tried to hide the gun. He bragged about the murder to his cousin. He showed no remorse for what he had done. Late on the night of September 1st, 1993, the police received a call from Annie Gosha. She told them that her daughter Ruby had been shot. The Troy Police Department sent officers to the house. They also put out a "Be on the Lookout" bulletin. This bulletin went to other police departments in the area. It described a vehicle that might be connected to the crime. The Loverne Police Department received this bulletin. Officer Clifton Wells went to check the area. He went to the house of Hollywood's father. There, he found a vehicle that matched the description from the bulletin. The truck was parked at the father's house. Officer Wells asked Holly's father where Holly was. The father told the officer that Holly lived in a shed next to the house. Officer Wells went to the shed and arrested Hollywood. After the arrest, Officer Wells took Holly to the Loverne Police Department. Holly was placed in a cell. Troy Police Officer Donald Brown came to the station. He read Holly his Miranda rights. These are the rights that tell a person they can remain silent and have a lawyer. Officer Brown also performed a gunshot residue test on Holly's hands. This test could show if Holly had recently fired a gun. Troy Police Officer Lewis Fannin arrived to transport Holly from Loverne to Troy. During the drive, Holly spoke without being asked. He said, "You motherfuckers must think I am crazy. What do I look like going in somebody's house shooting them in the head while they are asleep?" Officer Fannin did not ask him any questions. Holly said this on his own. The officer later testified that no one had told Holly any details about the crime. Holly knew exactly what had happened and tried to make himself sound innocent. Back in Loverne, something important happened. Calvin Salter, Holly's cousin, was still at the shed. Officer Donald Brown went there. Salter decided to cooperate with the police. He led the officers to a wooded area near the shed. There, under a pile of leaves, the officers found the 12-gauge shotgun. The gun was buried just as Holly had hidden it. This was very important evidence. It connected Holly directly to the murder. The police also collected other evidence. They found shotgun shells that Holly had thrown out of the truck window. The forensic scientist examined the shotgun and the pellets found in Ruby's head. He matched the wadding and the lead shot to the type of ammunition used in that gun. The evidence was strong and clear. The case went to the Pike County District Court. A grand jury indicted Hollywood for capital murder. The state said the murder was capital because it happened during a burglary. Holly had entered the house unlawfully with the intent to commit a crime. Under Alabama law, killing someone during a burglary is a capital offense. That means the death penalty could be applied. The trial began in October 1994. Holly was represented by 3 lawyers. The state presented its evidence. Ruby's mother testified about the events of that night. Calvin Salter testified about driving Holly to Troy and about what Holly told him after the shooting. The police officers testified about the arrest and the evidence. The forensic scientist explained how the shotgun and the pellets matched. The prosecutor also showed that Holly had a prior violent felony conviction for shooting another girlfriend, Barbara Seiler. The state argued that this showed a pattern of violence. Holly's lawyers tried to defend him. They argued that Holly was not guilty of burglary. They said there was no evidence that he broke into the house. But under Alabama law, a breaking was not required. Entering unlawfully was enough. The jury was not convinced by the defense. On October 20th, 1994, the jury reached a verdict. They found Hollywood guilty of capital murder. The same jury then had to decide his sentence. They heard evidence about Holly's difficult childhood. They heard from his family members. But they also heard about the aggravating factors. The jury voted on the sentence. The vote was 10-2 in favor of the death penalty. Under Alabama law, at least 10 jurors must vote for death for that recommendation to be made. On December 9, 1994, the trial judge held a separate sentencing hearing. The judge reviewed the evidence. He found 3 aggravating circumstances. First, the murder happened during a burglary. Second, Holly had a prior conviction for a violent felony. Third, Holly committed the murder while he was on parole. The judge found no mitigating circumstances that were strong enough to outweigh these factors. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation. He sentenced Hollywood to death. After the trial, Holly appealed his case. The case went to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals. That court reviewed the conviction and the death sentence. They looked at all the claims Holly's lawyers made. They checked to see if the trial was fair. The appeals court found no major errors. They affirmed the conviction and the death sentence in 1996. Holly then appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court. That court also affirmed the sentence in 1998. After that, Holly asked the United States Supreme Court to hear his case. But the Supreme Court refused. This meant the state could proceed with the execution. But Holly was not finished fighting. In 1999, he filed a post-conviction petition under Alabama Rule of Criminal Procedure 32. This is a way to challenge a conviction after all direct appeals are done. Holly raised several claims. He said his lawyers had been ineffective. He said they failed to properly investigate and present evidence of his low intelligence. He also said he was mentally retarded. He argued that executing someone with mental retardation was unconstitutional under a Supreme Court case called Atkins v. Virginia. The state court held hearings on these claims. They heard from psychologists and from Holly's former teachers. The psychologists tested Holly and found his IQ was low. They said his IQ was between 61 and 69. They also said he had low adaptive functioning in some areas. But they also found he had a high level of adaptive functioning in other areas. He could work, drive, manage money, and solve problems. The teachers testified that Holly was in special education classes. But they said he was an average student in those classes. He could function on his own. The state court made a decision. They found that Holly was not mentally retarded under Alabama law. The law required 3 things: low IQ, significant deficits in adaptive behavior, and that these problems started before age 18. The court found Holly did not have significant deficits in adaptive behavior. He had too many skills and abilities. The court also found his trial lawyers were not ineffective. The lawyers had investigated and made reasonable strategic decisions. They had a good reason not to present the mental health evidence. That evidence could have hurt Holly's case. It contained harmful information, like his prior arrests and his denial of drinking. The state appeals court agreed and upheld the denial. Holly then took his case to federal court. He filed a petition for habeas corpus. This is a way for state prisoners to ask federal courts for relief. A federal district judge looked at his case. The judge agreed with Holly on one issue. The judge found that his trial lawyers were ineffective. They should have investigated and presented evidence of his low intellectual functioning. The judge said this might have changed the outcome. The judge granted habeas relief and overturned the death sentence. But the state of Alabama appealed that decision. The case went to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The appeals court looked at the case very carefully. They applied the strict rules of the federal habeas law. They had to give great respect to the state court's findings. The appeals court reversed the district judge's decision. They found that the state courts had made reasonable decisions. Holly's lawyers had known about his low intelligence. They had read Dr. Kirkland's report. They chose not to present that evidence for strategic reasons. The evidence could have opened the door to damaging information. The appeals court also found no prejudice. Even with the mental health evidence, there was no reasonable probability the outcome would change. The murder was brutal and the aggravating factors were strong. Holly's conviction and death sentence were restored. After that, Holly made one more attempt. He asked the United States Supreme Court to stop his execution. He argued he was mentally disabled and had been denied effective counsel. But the Supreme Court rejected his appeal in a 7-2 vote. He also asked Governor Bob Riley for clemency. The governor reviewed the case. The governor said the conviction and sentence had been upheld by all the courts. He saw no reason to stop the execution. The governor rejected the clemency request on September 9, 2010. On the same day, September 9, 2010, Hollywood was taken to Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. The prison prepared for the execution by lethal injection. Holly was 50 years old. He met with his family and friends before the execution. He did not request a special meal. He did not give any final words. At 6:21 p.m., the lethal injection was administered. Hollywood was pronounced dead. Two of his sisters came to witness the execution. As their brother was put to death, they screamed, cried, and prayed loudly. He did not respond to them. He did not say anything. After the execution, Ruby Ghosh's family finally had closure. Her brother, her sister, her son, and her daughter had been waiting for this day for many years. They had suffered the loss of Ruby in a brutal and senseless way. The trial and all the appeals had taken a long time. But in the end, justice was carried out according to the law. Hollywood was the 48th person executed in Alabama since 1976. He was the 4th person executed in Alabama in 2010. His case became another example of how the death penalty process works. It involves many steps: trial, direct appeals, post-conviction reviews, federal habeas petitions, and finally, if all fails, execution. The story of Hollywood ended on September 9, 2010, when he was put to death for the murder of Ruby Gosha, a crime he had committed 17 years earlier. Story 4. Cal Coburn Brown was born on April 16, 1958, in the state of California. He was a white male. From the very beginning of his life, things were not easy for him. His birth was traumatic, which meant there were complications when he came into the world. As a baby, he seemed agitated and restless. His mother did not form a close bond with him. She appeared frustrated and impatient whenever she had to care for him. This lack of emotional connection between mother and child was noticed by people around them. As Cal grew from a baby into a toddler, his behavior became more difficult. By the time he was 2 or 3 years old, people started to describe his actions as out of bounds. This meant he did not behave in the way that most children his age behaved. He was hard to manage and did not follow normal rules of behavior. Because of this, other people began to pull away from him. They rejected him and avoided him. He had trouble making friends and fitting in with others. The pattern of rejection started early in his life. His family life was also very unstable. His mother was married 5 times over the course of her life. During her second marriage, there was serious trouble. Cal and his mother were both physically and psychologically abused by her second husband. This meant that Cal grew up in a home where violence and fear were present. He saw abuse happening to his mother, and he was also a victim of abuse himself. This kind of environment created a lot of stress and confusion for a young child. The abuse he witnessed and experienced likely shaped the way he saw the world and how he related to other people. Despite all of these problems at home and in his social life, Cal was very intelligent. When he was in the 7th or 8th grade, he took an IQ test. He scored 144. This score put him in the gifted range of intelligence. This meant that he was much smarter than most people his age. He had the ability to think clearly and plan things out. However, his intelligence did not help him control his behavior or fix the problems in his personal life. He continued to struggle with relationships and with following the rules of society. As a young adult, Cal Brown attended Oregon State University. He was a freshman there in 1984. But even while he was trying to get an education, his past patterns of violence and control over women continued. In that same year, he committed a serious offense against a woman. He had been introduced to a 24-year-old woman by her babysitter. Brown went to her home wearing a hat and carrying a backpack. He told her he had a sprained leg and convinced her to let him rest inside. But when she turned her head to call a cab for him, he attacked her. He used a long leather thong to choke her from behind. The thong caught on her lip, but she was able to fight back and scream. A police officer who happened to be nearby heard her screams and arrested Brown. When the police searched his backpack, they found a large knife and a roll of duct tape. The woman's 2 young sons were home during the attack. This event showed that Brown was willing to use weapons and force to control women. Because of this attack, Brown was sentenced as a dangerous offender in Oregon. He was sent to prison. While he was in prison, he received some mental health treatment. Doctors there prescribed him a drug called lithium to help stabilize his mood. During his time in prison, some professionals noted that the lithium seemed to help him. But the state of Oregon did not closely monitor his medication after he was released. He served the minimum sentence of 7.5 years for the Oregon assault. On March 25, 1991, he was released on parole from the Oregon State Penitentiary. Before his release, he received a psychiatric evaluation that was favorable. This meant that the evaluators thought he was not a current danger, and they approved his release. After he got out of prison, Brown was placed under the supervision of a parole officer. This officer specialized in supervising sex offenders. The parole officer was given a letter from the district attorney who had prosecuted Brown in the 1984 assault case. In that letter, the district attorney wrote that he considered Brown to be one of the most dangerous criminals he had ever prosecuted. He also wrote that unless Brown had changed completely in prison, he would remain a potential mutilator and killer of women. This warning was very serious, but the parole system still allowed Brown to go free. During the first 2 months after his release, Brown did some normal things. He enrolled again as a student at Oregon State University. He also met with his parole officer as required. But toward the end of that 2-month period, his parole officer could not get in touch with him. Brown stopped reporting and stopped answering calls. On May 23, 1991, the parole officer requested that an arrest warrant be filed against Brown for violating the terms of his parole. On that very same day, Brown was not at his home or at school. He had traveled north to the state of Washington. He was near the Seattle-Tacoma airport. He was about to meet a young woman who had no idea what he was capable of. On the morning of May 23, 1991, a 21-year-old woman named Holly Carol Washa was at the Wyndham Garden Hotel near the Seattle-Tacoma airport. She had just quit her part-time job there and was leaving the parking lot in her blue 1985 Oldsmobile. Holly had moved to Washington from Ogallala, Nebraska, 3 years earlier because she wanted to become a flight attendant. She worked as a dispatcher at TCI Cablevision and also had a second job at a Hickory Farm store. She was a young woman trying to build a life for herself in a new city. As she drove out of the parking lot, Cal Brown pointed at one of her tires as if something was wrong. She stopped her car to check. That was the moment her life changed forever. Brown forced his way into Holly's car. He pulled a knife on her and grabbed her by the hair. This knife was actually a multi-purpose tool called a Leatherman, which had a folding blade. He held the knife to her face and demanded that she drive or die. She had no choice but to obey him. He started going through her purse and found only a small amount of change. Then he found her checkbook. He forced her to write a check for $350, which was the entire balance in her checking account. He made her drive to a Sea First Bank in Federal Way, and they went through the drive-up window. She cashed the check and gave him the money. After getting the cash, Brown made Holly drive to the Seattle waterfront. Once they were there, he tied her hands behind her back using the strap from her purse. He forced her into the passenger seat of her own car, and he took over the driving. He asked her many questions about her daily schedule, who her roommates were, and what they did. He wanted to know if anyone would come looking for her soon. Then he drove to a gun shop and purchased a pair of handcuffs while Holly sat tied up in the car. He was now equipped with restraints. He drove her to his room at the Shadow Motel, which was near the airport area. He paid for an extra night's stay. Once they were inside the motel room, Brown ordered Holly to remove all of her clothing. He then tied her to the bed using his neckties and her purse strap. He cut up her shirt and stuffed it into her mouth to keep her quiet. After that, he ordered her to get dressed again, and he took her to a Burger King drive-thru. While they were in the drive-thru line, he held the knife where she could clearly see it, so she knew not to try anything. He was showing her that he was always in control. When they returned to the motel, he ordered her to take off her clothes again and lie face down on the bed. He told her not to scream. She was terrified and did what she was told. Brown later claimed that she began performing a sexual act on him and that he took this as her consent, but she was clearly a captive who had no real choice. He then had sexual intercourse with her for about 2 hours. During this time, he noticed that she was looking at the door, which made him think she was considering escape. He decided he needed to gain more control over her and make her more afraid of him. He tied her up again, this time with her arms and legs spread apart and her hands behind her back. He gagged her mouth. Then he whipped her with a belt about half a dozen times. He allowed her to get dressed again, tied her hands behind her back, and drove her to Federal Way to get pizza. When they returned to the motel, he forced her to undress once more, tied her face down in a spread eagle position, and had intercourse with her again. At about 11 o'clock that night, Brown made a telephone call to a woman named Susan, whom he had met on an airplane a few days earlier. He confirmed their plans to meet that weekend in Palm Springs, California. After that call, he got into the bed with Holly, who was still tied up and gagged, and they both dozed off. The next day, which was Friday, May 24th, Brown forced Holly to drive him to her apartment. He was looking for checks that belonged to her roommates, so he could forge them and cash them. He found some checks and tried to cash them for $500 each, but the banks wanted to compare the signatures on the checks with the signature cards on file. When the banks would not give him the money, he became very angry with Holly. She started driving erratically, which made him even angrier. When they returned to the motel, Brown tied Holly to the bed again. He tied her face down, spread eagle, with her hands handcuffed behind her back and her mouth gagged with a washcloth. Then he began to torture her in terrible ways. He took an aftershave lotion bottle and used it to penetrate her vaginally and anally. He shaved her pubic hair. He took a hot hair dryer and held it close to her vagina, her breasts, and her stomach, burning her skin. He also took an electrical extension cord that had the end cut off and used it to shock her body. He knew this was very painful for her. He later admitted to police that what he did to her was torture. He said he did these things to gain control over her through fear and intimidation. That evening, around 8:45, Brown left for the Seattle-Tacoma airport to catch his flight to California. He forced Holly into the trunk of her own car. She was still handcuffed with her hands behind her back. He drove to the parking lot of the Doug Fox Travel Agency and parked there for a moment. But he saw shuttle buses driving around the lot, and he became worried that someone might discover Holly. He knew she could make noise by banging on the trunk, and he was afraid she might scream or get free. He decided he could not leave her alive. He went to the trunk, opened it, and cut her throat with 3 swipes of his knife. He also stabbed her several times in her chest and abdominal areas. He later told police that he killed her because he did not want to leave any witnesses. He also admitted that he had kidnapped her because he needed money to get to California, and he did not want to walk into a bank where cameras could record his face. After he killed Holly, Brown noticed that her blood was leaking from the trunk of the car. He panicked because he knew someone would see the blood. He drove the car away from the Doug Fox lot and parked it in a different location. He chose the budget park and ride lot near Shumsky's restaurant, which was also close to the airport. He left Holly's body locked in the trunk of her blue Oldsmobile. Then he went to the airport and flew to California to meet Susan. In California, Brown met Susan at a hotel near the Ontario airport. They drove in her sports car to Palm Springs and checked into a Ramada Inn. They had planned to stay in separate rooms, but there was a mix-up with the reservation, so they had to share a room with only one bed. They slept in the same bed that night, but did not have intercourse. The next day, Sunday, May 26th, they spent the day touring Palm Springs together. She drove her red Corvette. That night, after they returned from dinner around midnight, they started kissing and fondling each other. He performed a sexual act on her, and then he offered to give her a back rub. She lay face down on the bed, trusting him. But the moment she lay down, Brown violently jerked her arms behind her back. He told her not to scream, but she did scream. As soon as she screamed, he slit her throat with the knife. She kept screaming, so he handcuffed her and brought the knife around to her chest, pointing it at her heart. He told her he just wanted her money. He repositioned her on the bed and tied her to it using her pantyhose. He shaved her pubic hair. Then he raped her vaginally and forced her to perform oral sex on him. After that, he ordered her to write him a check for $4,000. She was bleeding heavily and terrified, and it took her 3 attempts to write the check correctly because he kept rejecting her work. Brown became worried because Susan was losing a lot of blood. He told her he was going out to get medical supplies. He tried to gag her with a sock and restrain her arms above her head, but he stopped because she started coughing up blood. Her feet, however, remained handcuffed to the bed. He left the room, telling her he would be back. While he was gone, Susan managed to reach the telephone and call the front desk of the hotel. She told the clerk what had happened and asked for help. The hotel staff were alerted to the situation, and they knew something terrible had occurred in that room. They would soon take action, but for now, Susan was alone, bleeding and waiting for help, while Brown was somewhere outside the hotel, unaware that she had made the call. When Susan called the front desk of the Ramada Inn in Palm Springs, the hotel staff quickly responded. They called the police, who arrived at the hotel within minutes. Susan was still handcuffed to the bed and bleeding from her throat, but she was able to give the officers a clear description of her attacker and tell them that he had left the room to get supplies. The police officers immediately began searching the hotel parking lot. One officer, Glenn Haas, spotted a man who matched Susan's description walking near a red Corvette. The officer drew his firearm and ordered the man to stop and put his hands up. The man identified himself as Cal and said the knife was in his right front pocket. When asked for his last name, he said Brown. The officer arrested Cal Brown on suspicion of attempted murder. Brown was taken to the Palm Springs police station for questioning. Before each interview, the detectives read him his Miranda rights, which informed him that he had the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Brown said he understood his rights and agreed to talk with the detectives. During the first interview, Brown calmly and clearly admitted to attacking Susan in the hotel room. He described in detail what he had done to her, but then he told the detectives something more. He said, "I have something else to tell you, and you better get something to write with." He then told them about the young woman he had abducted in Washington state. He told them where her body could be found. He said her body was in the trunk of a blue 1985 Oldsmobile parked at the Budget Park and Ride lot near the Seattle-Tacoma Airport. He also said he still had the keys to that car in his possession. The Palm Springs detectives immediately called the King County Police in Washington. The King County police officers were sent to the Budget Park and Ride lot. They found the blue Oldsmobile in parking space 266. When they opened the trunk, they discovered the body of Holly Washa. She was wearing a leather jacket covered in blood. The strap of her purse was tied and knotted tightly around her neck. The strap was sunken into a deep slash wound across her throat. The medical examiner later determined that her death was caused by the cut to her throat and by strangulation from the ligature. He also found severe bruising, burns, and other injuries that confirmed she had been tortured and sexually assaulted before she died. The evidence in the trunk matched what Brown had described in his confession. Back in California, Brown was interviewed 2 more times by the Palm Springs detectives. The third interview was actually initiated by Brown himself. He asked to speak with them again. In these interviews, he gave a detailed narrative of everything that had happened, from kidnapping Holly to killing her. He confessed to both the California attack on Susan and the Washington murder of Holly. These statements were audio recorded by the police without Brown's knowledge, which was legal in California. Brown eventually pleaded guilty in California to attempted murder, aggravated mayhem, torture, robbery, and false imprisonment for his attack on Susan. He was sentenced to life in prison in California. However, the state of Washington also wanted to prosecute him for the murder of Holly Washa. Brown was extradited back to Washington to stand trial. On June 11, 1991, he was formally charged with aggravated first-degree murder in King County Superior Court. The trial began in October 1993. During the guilt phase, the prosecution presented a strong case. They entered Brown's taped confessions into evidence. They also presented physical evidence from the motel room and from Holly's body, which matched Brown's descriptions. The prosecutor also called Susan to testify about the attack on her in California, to show that Brown had a pattern and to rebut his claims about consent. The defense argued that the tape recordings should not have been allowed because Brown was not told they were being recorded, but the judge ruled that the recordings were legal under California law and could be used. On December 10, 1993, the jury found Brown guilty of premeditated murder in the first degree. The jury also found that there were aggravating circumstances. They determined that Brown committed the murder to conceal his identity and that he committed it during the course of robbery, rape, and kidnapping. Because of these aggravating factors, Brown was eligible for the death penalty. The penalty phase of the trial then began. The defense presented evidence of Brown's difficult childhood, his traumatic birth, his unstable family life, and his mental disorders. They called a psychologist who testified that Brown had antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism, and manic syndrome. The prosecution called a psychiatrist who disagreed about the lithium treatment and said Brown did not have a disorder that required it. On December 27, 1993, the jury concluded that there were not enough mitigating circumstances to merit leniency. The judge sentenced Brown to death on January 28, 1994. After his conviction, Brown began a long series of appeals. In 1997, the Washington State Supreme Court reviewed his case and affirmed his conviction and death sentence. In 2005, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed his conviction because of a potential error in how a juror was excluded. However, in June 2007, the United States Supreme Court reversed that decision and reinstated the death sentence. Brown filed additional legal challenges over the years. He argued that Washington's lethal injection method was cruel and unusual punishment. He also claimed that his mental illness had not been properly considered. These arguments caused delays. In March 2009, his execution was scheduled, but just hours before it was to happen, the Washington State Supreme Court granted a stay to review the lethal injection challenge. During this time, the Washington Department of Corrections changed its execution protocol. Instead of using a 3-drug combination, they switched to a single drug called sodium thiopental. This change addressed many of the concerns about the method causing pain. In July 2010, the Washington State Supreme Court lifted the stay and allowed the execution to proceed. Brown made one more attempt to stop it. He asked Governor Chris Gregoire to commute his sentence to life in prison without parole. He argued that his bipolar disorder made him unfit for execution. On September 8, 2010, the governor denied his request, stating that the jury had heard the evidence of his mental disorder and had still decided on death. The U.S. Supreme Court and other courts also rejected his final appeals. On September 10, 2010, Cal Coburn Brown was executed by lethal injection at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. His time of death was 12:56 a.m. He was 52 years old. He made a lengthy statement before he died. He did not apologize to Holly's family. He said he understood their hatred for him and that he forgave that hatred. He hoped the execution would give them closure. He also complained that other killers who murdered many more people, such as the Green River killer Gary Ridgway, had received life sentences while he was put to death for killing one person. He said he could not see that as true justice. His last words were, "Thank you, God bless my family." Members of Holly Wash's family witnessed the execution, including her father, brother, and sisters. After the execution, the prison staff confirmed that the procedure was carried out humanely. Holly's family expressed relief that the long wait was finally over. Brown's death brought a final close to a case that had spanned nearly 2 decades, but the young woman whose life he took was gone forever, and no punishment could ever bring her back. Story 5. Teresa Wilson Bean was born on April 26, 1969, in Pittsylvania County, Virginia. Pittsylvania County is a rural area in the southern part of the state. Teresa was raised in that county by her family. She had a father, a brother, and a sister. Her parents later divorced, and her father remarried a woman named Brenda, who became Teresa's stepmother. Teresa grew up like many other children in that area. She went to school in the local public schools. She was not a top student, but she was able to complete her high school education. She graduated from high school. After high school, she decided to continue her education. She enrolled in a college and completed 1 year of courses. However, she did not finish college. She stopped attending after that first year. As a young adult, Teresa had jobs to support herself. She worked at different places. She also had personal relationships. She had a son and a daughter. Her daughter was named Christy Lynn Bean. She also had a son named Billy. Teresa was a mother to these 2 children. She raised them as a single parent for some time. Her life was not easy, but she managed to work and take care of her family. At some point, Teresa got into trouble with the law. She was convicted of a crime involving prescription forgery. This was a nonviolent offense. She forged a prescription to get medication. Because of this conviction, she was placed on probation. She had to follow certain rules set by the court. During that time, she did not commit any violent acts. Her probation officer later reported that she followed the rules of her probation and did not show any violent behavior. This was the only criminal conviction in her past. Teresa continued to work to support herself and her children. She eventually got a job at a large textile company called Dan River, Incorporated. The company was located in Danville, Virginia, which is near Pittsylvania County. She worked there as an employee. In March or April of the year 2000, Teresa met a man named Julian Clifton Lewis, Jr. Julian also worked at Dan River. He had been employed there for many years. Julian was a recent widower. His first wife had passed away in January of that year after a long illness. He had 3 adult children from that marriage. One of his sons was named Jason, another was named Charles, who was often called CJ, and he had a daughter named Kathy. Teresa and Julian began to talk at work. They developed a relationship. In June 2000, Teresa moved into Julian's home in Danville. They decided to get married. They were married soon after she moved in. After they married, Teresa quit her job at Dan River. She no longer worked outside the home. She became a housewife. Julian continued to work at the factory. Their life together continued. In December 2001, Julian's older son, Jason, was killed in a car accident. Jason had a life insurance policy. Julian was the beneficiary of that policy. As a result, Julian received more than $200,000 in insurance money. Julian placed that money into an investment account. The account was in his name only. He was the only person who could withdraw money from it. In February 2002, Julian used some of his money to buy a piece of land. The land was about 5 acres in size and was located in Pittsylvania County. On that land, Julian purchased a mobile home. He and Teresa moved into that mobile home. They began living there together as a married couple. Teresa was now the wife of Julian Lewis and the stepmother of his adult children, including CJ and Kathy. She lived in the mobile home with Julian, and they continued their daily routine. Julian went to work, and Teresa stayed at home. Teresa had a history of being interested in money and what she could gain from relationships. She had told a friend that she was using Julian for his money and that he would buy her things. This was a pattern in her behavior. She was focused on financial gain from her marriage. She also had a habit of taking prescription medications. Her use of these drugs was a part of her daily life. She had been taking them for some time. Her family and friends noticed her reliance on these medications. She did not have any violent past, but she had this ongoing issue with prescription drugs. Teresa's daughter, Christy, lived with her sometimes. Christy was a teenager at that time. Teresa's son, Billy, was also around. Teresa continued to be a mother to her children while living with Julian. She seemed to be adjusting to her new life as Julian's wife. She did not have a job, so she spent her days at the mobile home. She would talk to friends and family on the phone. She also had time to think about her future. Julian's son, CJ, was an Army reservist. In August 2002, CJ was called to active duty with the National Guard. He had to report for service in Maryland. Before he left, CJ made arrangements for his property and his life insurance. He created a will. He also obtained a life insurance policy for $250,000. He named his father, Julian, as the main person to receive the money if he died. He named Teresa as the second person to receive the money if Julian was no longer alive. This was a legal document. Teresa continued her life in the mobile home with Julian. Julian continued to work his job. They had a routine. They would talk in the evenings. They would go to bed together. On the surface, they appeared to be a normal married couple. Teresa had a past with a forgery conviction, a focus on money, and a habit of taking prescription drugs. But she had no history of violence. She had never been in trouble for any violent crime. She was living quietly in the rural county. Her life had changed from being a working single mother to being a wife living in a new home. Teresa stayed in contact with her own family. Her father, stepmother, brother, and sister were still alive. They visited her and talked to her. She also kept in touch with her children. Her daughter Christy was now 16 years old. Teresa and Christy had a relationship. Teresa was a mother to Christy. She was also a stepmother to Kathy and CJ, although they were adults and did not live with her. Teresa and Julian had been married for a little over 2 years. They lived in their mobile home on the 5 acres of land. Julian was the main earner. Teresa stayed home. She had some money available to her from Julian. She used that money for daily expenses. She also had access to Julian's bank account to some extent. She was not working, so she had a lot of free time. She used that time to talk to people on the phone and to think about her future. She was not happy with just being a housewife. She wanted more money. Teresa had a pattern of using people to get what she wanted. She had used Julian for his money. She had also been willing to do things to get her way. She had a criminal record for prescription forgery, which showed she was willing to break the law to get drugs. She was not a violent person, but she was a person who was focused on her own financial benefit. She continued to live with Julian in their home. Their life continued in the fall of 2002. Julian went to work each day. Teresa stayed at home. She made plans for her daily activities. She had no job, so she could do whatever she wanted during the day. She spent time at the mobile home. She also had a car and could drive to places. She was living a quiet life on the surface, but she had a strong desire for money and was willing to use her relationships to get it. In the fall of 2002, Teresa began spending time away from the mobile home. She went to a Walmart store in Danville. While she was there, she met 2 young men. Their names were Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller. Matthew was 22 years old. Rodney was 19 years old. Teresa had never met these men before, but she started talking to them in the store. After the conversation, she and Matthew exchanged telephone numbers. They began to talk on the phone very often. Soon after that, Teresa started a sexual relationship with Matthew. He was 11 years younger than her. On at least one occasion, Teresa also had sexual intercourse with Rodney. She also performed a lingerie show for both men at her home. These were the first steps in building a relationship with them. Teresa then involved her 16-year-old daughter, Christy, in these meetings. One day, Teresa took Christy to a parking lot in Danville. Matthew and Rodney were also there. Teresa introduced her daughter to Rodney. Christy had never met Rodney before. Teresa then arranged for Christy to have sexual intercourse with Rodney in one car. At the same time, Teresa had sexual intercourse with Matthew in the other vehicle. They were parked side by side. Teresa was using sex to gain control over these men. She was also using her own daughter in this plan. After some time, Teresa and Matthew started talking about a plan. They discussed killing Julian Lewis. The reason was money. Teresa knew she would get money if Julian died. She promised Matthew that they would share the insurance money she would receive. Teresa then brought Rodney into the plan as well. They began to make specific arrangements for the murder. Teresa was the one who started this plan and kept it moving forward. The first plan was put into action on October 23, 2002. On that day, Teresa went to a bank. She withdrew $1,200 in cash. This was her own money. She met Matthew and Rodney at a shopping center. She gave them the cash. She told them to use the money to buy guns and ammunition to kill Julian. Matthew gave the money to a friend of his. That friend used the money to buy 3 firearms. 2 of them were shotguns. The friend also bought ammunition for the shotguns. Teresa then told Matthew and Rodney the route that Julian took when he drove home from work. The plan was for the men to follow Julian on the road. They would stop his car and kill him. They wanted the murder to look like a robbery. Teresa stayed at home that evening. The men went to the route and waited. But the plan did not work. Another vehicle was driving close to Julian on the road. The men could not carry out the plan because someone else would see them. They had to give up on that attempt. Teresa did not give up. She, Matthew, and Rodney quickly made a second plan. This time they decided to kill Julian in his own home. They also added a new part to the plan. They decided to kill Julian's son, CJ, as well. Their reason was that CJ had a life insurance policy for $250,000. Teresa was the secondary beneficiary. She would get that money if Julian was already dead. They planned to kill CJ when he came home for his father's funeral. But things changed. Teresa learned that CJ would be visiting the mobile home on the night of October 29th and 30th. That meant he would be there at the same time as Julian. So Teresa, Matthew, and Rodney made a new decision. They would kill both Julian and CJ that same night, at the same time, in the mobile home. The night of October 29th, 2002 came. Teresa and Julian were in the mobile home. CJ was also there visiting. Teresa knew what would happen that night. She had a routine to follow. She talked with Julian. They prayed together before they went to bed. She then arranged for her daughter Christy to call Julian and talk to him on the phone. This was a deliberate act. She wanted Julian to think everything was normal. She wanted to make sure he did not suspect anything was wrong. She then went to the kitchen. She prepared a lunch bag for Julian. She wrote a note on the bag that said, "I love you. I hope you have a good day." She drew a smiley face on the bag and wrote inside it, "I miss you when you're gone." She put the lunch bag in the refrigerator. This was also a deliberate act. She was creating evidence that she was a loving wife. She wanted to mislead people later. Then Teresa made the final preparations. She unlocked the back door of the mobile home. The men would enter through that door. She also made sure the family dog, a pit bull, was locked in a middle bedroom. She did not want the dog to bark or attack the shooters. After all that, she went to bed with Julian. She lay down next to him. She waited for the men to arrive. During the early morning hours of October 30th, 2002, Matthew and Rodney drove past the mobile home several times. They saw that lights were on inside. They did not stop because they were afraid someone was still awake. Eventually, the lights were turned off. The men then approached the home. They entered through the unlocked back door. They carried the 2 shotguns that Teresa had paid for. When they entered, they woke Teresa up. She had fallen asleep next to Julian while waiting. Matthew told her, "Teresa, get up." She got out of the bed. She walked into the kitchen. She left her husband in the bedroom. She stayed in the kitchen while the men went to work. Matthew went into the bedroom where Julian was sleeping. He fired the shotgun multiple times. He hit Julian in the upper left arm, shoulder, abdomen, pelvis, thighs, legs, arms, and chest. The bullets tore away large areas of tissue and broke several ribs. One piece of plastic wadding from a shotgun shell lodged in Julian's lung tissue. While Matthew was shooting Julian, Rodney went to the other bedroom. CJ was sleeping there. Rodney shot CJ several times. He hit CJ in the back, abdomen, chest, neck, left arm and shoulder, elbow, left thigh, face, and forearm. CJ died almost immediately from his wounds. After the shooting stopped, Teresa went back into the bedroom where Julian lay. Julian was still alive. He was bleeding heavily from his many wounds. Teresa did not try to help him. Instead, she picked up his pants and his wallet. She took these items from the bedroom and returned to the kitchen. There, she and Matthew opened the wallet. They took the cash that was inside. They divided the money between themselves. Julian was still alive in the other room, bleeding to death. Meanwhile, Rodney came back to the kitchen. He told Teresa and Matthew that CJ wouldn't die. He meant that CJ was not dead yet. Rodney then took Matthew's shotgun. He went back to CJ's bedroom. He fired 2 more shots into CJ's body. Then he returned to the kitchen. The men collected most of the spent shotgun shells from the floor. They did not want to leave evidence. Matthew hugged Teresa and kissed her. He told her he was sorry she had to go through this. Then the men left the mobile home. Teresa stayed inside the home with the 2 victims. Julian was still alive in the bedroom. He was suffering from extreme blood loss. Teresa did not call for help. She did not call 911. Instead, she picked up the telephone and called her former mother-in-law, Marie Bean. She talked to Marie. Then she called her best friend, Debbie Yeats. She talked to Debbie as well. She waited and waited. She did not call emergency services for about 45 minutes after the last shot was fired. At approximately 3:55 in the morning, Teresa finally called 911. She told the operator that an intruder had entered her home. She said the intruder shot her husband and stepson. She said both men were dead. She gave a false story. She claimed that an intruder armed with a pistol entered the bedroom. She said the intruder said, "Get up." She claimed her husband told her to go into the bathroom. She said she hid there while the intruder fired 4 or 5 times. She told the operator that the shooting happened at about 3:15 or 3:30 in the morning. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the mobile home at approximately 4:18 in the morning. That was 23 minutes after Teresa's 911 call. Teresa met the deputies at the front door. She told them that her husband's body was in the master bedroom. She said her stepson's body was in the other bedroom. The deputies went into the master bedroom. They found Julian. He was not dead. He was still alive. He was making slow moans. He was saying, "Baby, baby, baby, baby." A deputy asked him what his name was. Julian responded, "Julian." The deputy asked him if he knew who shot him. Julian responded, "My wife knows who done this to me." That was Julian's last statement. He died shortly after that in the mobile home. While the deputies were trying to help the victims, one deputy noticed Teresa on the telephone. He heard her say, "I told CJ about leaving that back door unlocked." She was trying to blame her dead stepson. She was saying he left the door open so the intruder could get in. The deputies then informed Teresa that her husband and stepson were dead. Teresa showed no emotion. She did not appear upset or sad. She did not cry. The deputies and investigators began their work. They took notes and collected evidence. They interviewed Teresa. During an interview, Teresa claimed that Julian had physically assaulted her a few days before his death. She also denied knowing who killed him. She said, "There is no way I would have killed my husband and stepson." She said the police only suspected her because she was not shot. She continued to tell false stories. She did not admit to the plan. Later that same day, Teresa made a phone call to Mike Campbell. Mike was Julian's supervisor at Dan River. Teresa told Mike that Julian had been murdered. Then she asked for Julian's paycheck. Mike told her she could pick it up after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The next day, Teresa called Mike again. She apologized for not picking up the check the day before. Then she asked again when she could get it. She was already trying to get Julian's money. She also spoke to Lieutenant Michael Booker. Lieutenant Booker was CJ's commanding officer. He called Teresa to express his condolences on the day of the murders. Teresa told him she was in shock. She again denied involvement. But she also told him she was the secondary beneficiary of CJ's life insurance. She said she had been told she would be contacted about getting her money within 24 hours. On November 4th, 2002, Teresa called Lieutenant Booker again. She asked for CJ's personal effects. She also asked for a photograph she had given him for a memorial service. Lieutenant Booker told her he would return the photograph, but he said the personal effects would go to CJ's sister, Kathy Clifton. Kathy was the immediate next of kin. Lieutenant Booker testified later that Teresa became very angry. She insisted that he bring the effects to her as soon as possible. He refused. Teresa then asked again about the life insurance money. She reminded him that she was the secondary beneficiary. When Lieutenant Booker told her she was still entitled to the money, Teresa responded, "That's fine, Kathy can have all of his effects as long as I get the money." Teresa also talked to Kathy Clifton, her stepdaughter. Teresa told Kathy that she had waited 45 minutes after the murders to call 911. She told Kathy she had called her ex-mother-in-law and her best friend before calling 911. On the night of the murders, Teresa called Kathy and told her she had already gone over the funeral arrangements with the funeral home. She told Kathy all she needed were the names of some of Julian's family members. She told Kathy that Kathy did not even need to come to the funeral home the next day. Teresa was trying to control everything. When Kathy did come to the funeral home the next day, Teresa told her she was the sole beneficiary of everything. She said that money was no object. On the day of the funerals, Teresa called Kathy again. She told her she had just left the hairdresser. She said she had gotten her nails done. She said she had bought a beautiful suit to wear to the funeral. She was focused on her own appearance, not on the deaths. She also offered to sell Julian's mobile home and land to Kathy. She was already trying to sell the property. Teresa also went to the bank. She tried to withdraw $50,000 from Julian's Prudential Securities account. She presented a check that appeared to be signed by Julian. The check was made payable to her, but the bank employee refused to cash it. The signature on the check did not match Julian's signature in the bank's records. The check was forged. Teresa had tried to take the money by fraud. Teresa's actions after the murders were all about money. She asked for Julian's paycheck. She asked about CJ's life insurance. She tried to take money from the investment account. She told Kathy she had money and was in charge. She showed no grief. She showed no sadness. She went to the hairdresser and bought a new suit. She was cold and calculating. The deputies and investigators noticed her behavior. They noticed she did not cry. They noticed she was on the phone making plans. They also heard Julian's dying words that his wife knew who did this to him. They began to focus on Teresa as a suspect. They continued to question her. They gathered more evidence. They searched the mobile home where Matthew and Rodney lived. They found the 2 shotguns. They also found 2 pairs of rubber household gloves. The gloves had primer residue on them. That residue comes from firing a gun. The evidence was building against Teresa. She was the one who had planned all of this. She was the one who used sex and money to control the 2 men. She was the one who unlocked the door and waited in the kitchen while her husband and stepson were shot to death. She was the one who took money from her dying husband's wallet, and she was the one who lied to the police and tried to blame others. The investigators continued to build their case against Teresa. They had Julian's dying words. They had Teresa's strange behavior. They had her calls about money. They had the guns and gloves from the shooter's home. The evidence was too strong for her to deny. On November 7, 2002, Teresa was interviewed again by investigator Isom. This time, she changed her story. She admitted that she had offered Matthew Schallenberger money to kill her husband. She told Isom that she had met Matthew at Walmart. She said she let him into the home on the night of the murders. But she still lied about some parts. She falsely claimed that Matthew shot both Julian and CJ by himself. She said he took the money and left. She said she had promised him half the insurance money, but changed her mind. After this interview, Teresa went with Isom to Matthew's residence. She pointed him out and identified him as her co-conspirator. This led to Matthew's arrest. The very next day, on November 8, 2002, Teresa asked to speak with Isom again. She was in the Danville City Jail at that time. She admitted she had not been fully truthful the day before. She confessed that Rodney Fuller was also involved. She told Isom that Rodney had shot CJ. She also admitted that her 16-year-old daughter, Christy, had helped with the planning. Teresa had involved her own child in this murder plot. These confessions were a major step. They gave the police the full picture of what had happened. They also gave them the evidence they needed to arrest Rodney and to charge Teresa. On November 20th, 2002, a grand jury indicted Teresa. She was charged with 2 counts of capital murder for hire. This was for killing Julian and CJ for money. She was also charged with conspiracy to commit capital murder, robbery, and using a firearm to commit the murders and the robbery. She was now formally accused of these serious crimes. The prosecutor, David Grimes, was determined to seek the death penalty against her. He viewed her as the worst of the 3 conspirators. He believed she was the mastermind. Teresa's lawyers, David Furrow and Thomas Blaylock, were appointed to represent her. They had experience with capital cases. They investigated the case thoroughly. They looked at all the evidence. They saw the crime scene photos. They heard the details of the murders. They knew the case against Teresa was very strong. They believed that if a jury heard the case, the jury would almost certainly sentence Teresa to death. The lawyers knew the local juries. They also knew the trial judge, Charles Strauss. Judge Strauss had never sentenced anyone to death before. Teresa's lawyers also knew that Rodney Fuller had made a deal with the prosecution. He agreed to cooperate and testify against the others. In exchange, the prosecutor agreed to recommend a life sentence for Rodney. Teresa's lawyers thought that Judge Strauss would be more likely to give Teresa a life sentence as well, because he would want to be fair. He would not want to give her death if the shooter got life. The lawyers recommended that Teresa plead guilty. They also recommended that she waive her right to a jury trial. Under Virginia law, if a defendant pleads guilty to capital murder, the judge decides the sentence, not a jury. Teresa's lawyers believed this was her best chance to avoid the death penalty. They discussed this with her in detail. They wrote her a long letter explaining all the reasons. They met with her and talked about it. Teresa agreed with her lawyers. She signed a letter stating she wished to plead guilty and be sentenced by the judge. Before she could enter her plea, a competency evaluation was done. A forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Barbara Haskins examined Teresa. Dr. Haskins also arranged for an IQ test. Teresa's IQ was tested at 72. A score of 70 or below is considered mentally retarded in Virginia. Teresa scored 72, which was just above that line. Dr. Haskins concluded that Teresa was competent. She could understand the charges against her. She could understand the possible penalties. She could work with her lawyers. Dr. Haskins said Teresa was capable of entering a guilty plea. On June 4, 2003, Teresa went to court. She stood before Judge Strauss. She pleaded guilty to all the charges. The judge questioned her carefully. He wanted to make sure she understood what she was doing. He made sure she knew she was giving up her right to a jury. He made sure she knew she could be sentenced to death or life in prison. Teresa said she understood. She entered her guilty pleas voluntarily. The judge accepted the pleas. Then the sentencing hearing began. The prosecutor presented a written summary of all the evidence. The summary described the murders in detail. It described Teresa's planning. It described how she used sex and money to recruit the men. It described how she unlocked the door and waited in the kitchen. It described how she took money from her dying husband's wallet. It described how she waited 45 minutes to call for help. It described her lies and her attempts to get money after the murders. The prosecutor argued that Teresa deserved death. He said her crimes were vile. Teresa's lawyers presented evidence to try to save her life. They showed that Teresa had no history of violence. They showed that her only prior conviction was for a non-violent forgery. They showed that she had followed the rules of her probation. They presented testimony from her probation officer. The officer said Teresa had been compliant and had never shown violence. They also presented a statement from the jail. The statement said Teresa had not caused any trouble while waiting for trial. Her father, brother, and sister were in the courtroom. The judge was told they would testify that they loved her and did not want her to die. The judge considered all of this. He looked at the aggravating factors and the mitigating factors. He rejected the argument that Teresa would be dangerous in the future. He based this on her lack of criminal history. However, he found that the vileness aggravating factor was proven. He said Teresa's conduct was outrageously vile, horrible, and inhuman. He said her acts showed a depravity of mind. He said she was the mastermind of the murders. He called her the head of this serpent. He sentenced her to death for both capital murder charges. He also sentenced her to life in prison for the robbery and to additional years for the other charges. Teresa's lawyers appealed her case to the Virginia Supreme Court. They argued that the death sentence was too harsh compared to similar cases. They argued that her co-defendants, who actually fired the guns, received life sentences. They argued that the judge was wrong to find the vileness factor. The Virginia Supreme Court reviewed the case. On June 4, 2004, they rejected all of Teresa's arguments. They affirmed the death sentences. They said the evidence of her depravity was overwhelming. They also said it was not unfair that her co-defendants got life. The court said they do not compare sentences between co-defendants. They upheld her conviction and her death sentence. Teresa then appealed to the United States Supreme Court. She asked them to review her case. But the Supreme Court refused to hear it. That happened in October 2004. After that, Teresa started the federal habeas corpus process. This is a way for prisoners to challenge their convictions in federal court. She filed a petition in the federal district court. She argued her lawyers were ineffective. She argued they should have presented more evidence about her low IQ and her drug problems. She argued that her mental problems made her less responsible. The district court reviewed the case. In 2009, they denied her petition. She appealed that decision to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. That court also reviewed her case. On June 25, 2010, they affirmed the district court's decision. They agreed that her lawyers had used a reasonable strategy. They found no constitutional violations. They upheld her death sentence. During this time, Teresa remained in prison. She was held at the Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women. The state's death row was only for men, so she was kept in a separate facility. While in prison, she became involved in religious activities. She sang gospel music. She counseled other inmates. She expressed remorse for her crimes. She said she thought about Julian and CJ every day. She wrote to supporters and asked for forgiveness. She said she wished she could take it all back. Her supporters continued to fight for her life. They argued that she was borderline mentally retarded. They argued that she was manipulated by a smarter man, Matthew Schallenberger. They argued that it was unfair that the actual shooters got life while she got death. Thousands of people signed petitions asking the governor to spare her. The European Union sent a letter asking for her sentence to be commuted. Author John Grisham also spoke out against her execution. Amnesty International and other groups campaigned for her. Teresa also asked for clemency from Governor Bob McDonnell. She submitted a petition on August 25, 2010. The governor reviewed the case. He considered her arguments. He also considered the facts of the murders. He noted that no medical expert had found her to be mentally retarded under Virginia law. He noted that she was an active participant in the crime. She had given the men money for guns. She had left the door unlocked. She had involved her daughter. He denied her first request for clemency on September 17, 2010. Her lawyers asked him to reconsider. He considered it again and denied it again on September 20, 2010. He said there was no compelling reason to set aside the sentence. Teresa's lawyers then filed an emergency appeal with the United States Supreme Court. They asked for a stay of execution. They argued again about her mental capacity. The Supreme Court considered the appeal. On September 21, 2010, they rejected it. They declined to stop the execution. All of Teresa's legal options were exhausted. The execution was set for September 23, 2010. On the morning of her execution, Teresa met with her 2 children. She also met with her spiritual advisor and her lawyers. She spent time with them. She wrote letters to her children. She was moved to the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. That is where the state carries out executions. She was allowed to choose a final meal. She requested fried chicken, sweet peas with butter, German chocolate cake, and a Dr. Pepper. That evening, at about 8:50 p.m., her lawyer, James Rocap, and the prison chaplain entered the death chamber. They looked exhausted and sad. At 8:55 p.m., Teresa entered the chamber. She was wearing a light blue shirt, dark blue pants, and flip-flops. She appeared frightened. Her jaw was clenched. She looked around the room nervously. Guards escorted her to the gurney. She lay down on it. They strapped her down with leather straps. At 8:58 p.m., a blue curtain was drawn across the window so the witnesses could not see. The execution team inserted the intravenous lines into her arms. At 9:09 p.m., the curtain was opened. The warden asked if she had any final words. Teresa's voice was garbled at first. She asked if Kathy Clifton was there. Kathy was her stepdaughter. Kathy was in an adjacent witness room. Then Teresa spoke clearly. She said, "I just want Kathy to know I love you, and I'm very sorry." The execution team then began the lethal injection. The first drug was thiopental sodium, which made her unconscious. The second drug was pancuronium bromide, which stopped her breathing. The third drug was potassium chloride, which stopped her heart. Teresa's left foot had been moving, but it stopped. Her toes twitched for a moment and then stopped. At 9:13 p.m., on September 23, 2010, Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis was pronounced dead. After her death, the curtain was closed again. Outside the prison, a small group of protesters stood. They were outnumbered by the media. Supporters expressed their sadness. They said the execution was too harsh. Kathy Clifton witnessed the execution. She had lost her mother to illness, her brother Jason in an accident, and then her father Julian and brother CJ to murder. She was the only surviving member of her immediate family. She attended the execution to honor her father and brother. She had kept scrapbooks of the case for years. Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller remained in prison. They had both been sentenced to life imprisonment. Matthew later committed suicide in prison in 2006. Rodney Fuller continues to serve his life sentence. Teresa's death was the first execution of a woman in Virginia since 1912. She was the 12th woman executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. The case ended with the execution of Teresa Lewis, but the pain and loss continued for the surviving family members. Kathy Clifton had to live with the memory of what happened to her father and brother. Teresa's own children and grandson had to live without their mother and grandmother. The story of the murders and the subsequent legal proceedings came to a final conclusion on that September night in 2010, when the state of Virginia carried out its sentence.